So you want to knit, but you have no idea where to start. You don't even know what to search for. And trust me, I get it. A year ago, I was exactly where you are at now. As my professor in university would like to put it, I was in a state of unconscious incompetence. I didn't know what I didn't know. And yet, 700 hours and 20 garments later, I feel like I finally gained the courage to knit anything that I want. And I want to help you get there too. That's why I came up with this 3-part video series titled Pre-Knitting, Peri-Knitting, and Post-Knitting, which condenses everything you need to know to start your knitting journey. So this is the first part, pre-knitting. Before we begin proper, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Yvette. Over here, I talk about all things art, from painting to knitting. And in this video specifically, this is a deep dive into Knitting 101. So without further ado, grab your knitting or a notebook in this case, and a cup of tea or coffee. I just have a plain old water bottle with me. So let's begin. So let's talk some supply first. You will obviously need some yarn and some knitting needles, and I'll go more in depth into those later. Other things that you need as well are some scissors, a ruler or tape measure, and some stitch markers. So these are examples of some stitch markers. I'm trying to show it up to you guys, but it looks something like that, and you can buy this off of Amazon. And all of the supplies that I will be talking about in this 3-part series will be linked in my Amazon storefront as well. If I could get it up in time, it'll be linked down in the description box below, so you guys do not have to look for all of these items. You can just click on the link. It'll be really simple. But in my opinion, you don't actually need to buy stitch markers, especially if you're not sure if you'll be knitting in the long run. I find that there are a lot of simpler, cheaper alternatives to stitch markers. For example, you can just use some safety pins. These work just as per stitch markers. There's literally no difference at all. If you don't have safety pins, what I recommend is you can use some loose thread or yarn. I have some barber cord that I just double knotted, and then this becomes a stitch marker as well. A stitch marker is basically to just mark your point in the project, especially if you're knitting in the round, which means you're knitting in a circle. So you just know where the beginning and the end of the circle is, or the round is. This is what stitch markers are for. It's just for marking different points in the project. So it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. On the subject of barber cords, I would recommend some barber cords as well. This is a shorter version, but I would recommend some barber cords if you guys want to, because what these do is that you can attach it to your knitting needle, something like that. You just attach it to the end. For example, when you're knitting, let's say a top or a sweater, and then you want to check the fit of the garment, you can just attach the barber cord on both sides like that, and then you can just transfer your stitches all the way to this barber cord. Of course, you need a bigger one than this. You just take it off the needle after you've transferred it to the barber cord, and then you can try it on. Simple as that. Barber cords are super handy and so much cheaper than if you were to get the actual knitting cords, which are way more expensive when they're actually the exact same purpose. So just if you want to save money, just get barber cords. Now let's talk knitting needles. There are many different ways that you can classify knitting needles. You can classify them by the size, by the materials, or even by the types of knitting needles they are. Whenever we think about knitting needles, the first image that will come to mind are those straight, long knitting needles, and those are what we call straight knitting needles. They come pointed on one end and a knot on the other end to hold all of your stitches in place to make sure that they don't fall off the knitting needle. These knitting needles are quite straightforward to use. However, they are really cumbersome and they can get very long because you have to knit the entire width of the garment and it has to fit on that knitting needle. So some other options as well are double pointed needles. I do not have those with me, but I'll put an image up here. But double pointed needles are basically needles that are pointed on both ends. These needles are especially helpful for knitting in the round, especially for garments that require a very small circumference, things like socks or even like gloves. Those circumferences would be really good to be knitted on with double pointed needles. The last category is circular needles, of which there are 2 kinds: fixed and interchangeable circular needles. As the name suggests, for fixed circulars, you can't remove the needle from the cable. So for interchangeable circular needles, which are all I have, you can untwist them, so they are basically detachable from the cable, but you can reattach it back by screwing it on, and it looks something like that if I were to screw it on all the way, but I'm lazy so I shan't, but you get the idea. My favorite kind is, of course, the interchangeable needles. These are all I have because I find that they offer a lot of flexibility. There are some things that you can do. You can buy an entire set of interchangeable needles and then you are kind of set for life. You have all of the sizes that you will ever need and you have all the cable lengths that you will ever need. However, if you're not too sure if knitting is a hobby that will actually stick with you, I would not recommend getting an interchangeable set because those can be quite pricey. So instead, I would recommend getting fixed circulars. Personally for me, what I did was I got a pair of Knit Pro needles. So I just got a 4mm Knit Pro needle as well as a 3.5, and then I think I got just one cable, and that served me well for my first project. So that's something that you can do. So you just have to make sure that if you're using circular needles that you are actually going to tighten it up over here with this pin that usually comes with the set. So you need to put the pin in through this hole over here and you just gotta make sure that you are kind of tightening it up like that. I only find one, but sometimes it comes as kind of rubber things instead. So you just hold two of the rubber pieces together and then you just tighten them to make sure that the knitting needle is really tightened with the cable and so that it would not loosen up with time when you're knitting, which is what happened to me the first few times. I was wondering what I was doing wrongly, but I was just hand tightening them and not tightening them up with the screw that was provided, and my needle kept coming undone. The moment I used that is not a problem for me anymore. So that is something that you guys should take note of if you guys are going to invest in some interchangeable circular needles. Next, there are also different knitting needle materials, namely wood, metal as well as plastic, and the two main materials that I use are wood and metal. Metal needles can be things like stainless steel, aluminum, and for wooden needles it could be like birch wood, which are the Knit Pro needles. That's something that I use as well. Metal needles are generally very sleek, they are very smooth to knit with, and I personally like knitting with metal needles because I like the sound that they make when you knit them together. But otherwise, they are really sleek, they are smooth, so it really allows for a nice and efficient knitting experience. You know, there's no friction at all, it is not grippy, and so that's really nice. However, when it comes to smoother, kind of slippery yarns, things like silk, that could be a bit difficult with this because the yarn may tend to drop off the needles more frequently or easily. So if you guys are beginner knitters, I might recommend wooden needles more because wooden needles are a bit more grippy. There's more friction compared to metal needles. So for the wooden needles, it definitely has more traction, there's more friction. The knitting experience may not be as smooth, but it definitely prevents the slippery yarns from sliding off your needles more. So yeah, I would recommend metal needles for like if you want a sleeker, smoother knitting experience, and wooden needles if you are a beginner knitter or if you are knitting with very slippery yarns like silk or even linen. So I know that there's a lot of information being thrown at you right now, so don't feel pressured to go out and buy an entire set of knitting needles. That is totally not necessary if you're just planning to dip your toes into the knitting world and you're not sure if it's something that will stick with you, and then you can just get one or two needles. My personal recommendation would be to get 4mm knitting needles because I find that those needles are the most flexible and versatile. It can be used for both warm weather and cold weather knits, and I find that it is kind of an in-between size, so it actually can go both ways for you. If you're not sure if you're going to make a summer top or a sweater, a 4mm needle will work really well. So I would recommend either a 4mm fixed circular or a 4 and 3.5mm sized needle because sometimes patterns do like to use two needle sizes to ensure a more polished and finished look. The 3.5mm needle will be used for all the finishes like the collar, the ribbing for the hem of the sleeves and things like that. So for cables, if you only want to buy one cable, then I would recommend a 32-inch or 80cm cable. The general rule of thumb is that you want your full length, that means your knitting needles and your cable needle, this entire length, to be a bit smaller than the circumference of your garment. You do not want it to be longer because otherwise the stitches will get really stretched apart. So generally speaking, this should be shorter than the circumference of your garment. With that being said, if you are going to buy just the one cable length, then I would recommend 80 centimeters or so, because that should be long enough that you can also use this technique called the magic loop for knitting the smaller circumference like the sleeve and the collar. I will attach some videos down below like how to do the magic loop and other tutorials as well, because if I were to include all this information in this video would be a few hours long and I don't think anyone would want to stick around for the entire duration of the videos. So I'll just link those extra videos down below. So lastly, there are different needle sizes. There are two main sizing charts for knitting needles. There is the US and the metric sizing, so this is how the sizing charts work. And so sometimes when people talk about 3mm or US 3, those are different, so you can use this chart as a reference for the conversion. I've amassed quite a few different knitting needles, so if you're curious about my personal recommendations, I really love the Chiago knitting needles. I'm a bit more biased towards metal knitting needles, so I already love the metal needles from Chiago to begin with. On top of that, I love that they are really sleek. It's a nice pointed finish, so it can really knit through the yarn really well, especially when it comes to tinier gauges like 3mm needles. I do want them to be a bit sharper, which allows for a better knitting experience. And one thing that I love about the Chiagos as well is the fact that it's just a very smooth join between the cable as well as the knitting needle. So it's really smooth here at this point here, so that the yarn doesn't actually get snagged or caught onto the join, which is what happens very often with my liquid knitting needles, so I do not really recommend those. And another thing is my cable over here has no memory. The Chiago knitting cables have no memory, which means to say they're just kind of full slack. They don't get like coiled up in different positions, which sometimes makes the knitting experience just a little bit less enjoyable. And I find that because a garment takes so many hours to knit, I do want every single aspect to be as enjoyable as possible. If you guys want to buy metal knitting needles, I actually do not know where those knitting needles are, but I would recommend the Knit Pro knitting needles. Those were actually my first pair of knitting needles as well, so I think I made a good first choice, and I would recommend that for you as well if you're planning to start knitting and want to use wooden needles. Then I would recommend the Knit Pro ones. I think those are really good. So the next big topic, and the topic that I'm most excited about, is yarn. So they can be classified in a couple of ways as well, such as yarn fibers, yarn weights, as well as the different forms that they come in. So let's talk yarn fibers first. There are plant-based fibers like cotton, linen, bamboo, animal-based fibers like silk, merino wool, Peruvian Highland wool, alpaca, things like that. And the last one is synthetic, which could be acrylic, nylon, polyester, things like that. I have actually done a whole video that goes in depth about yarn fibers that are warm weather friendly. So if you guys want to check that video out, I have also linked it down below. I actually have made a whole playlist full of all the important videos in that playlist, so go check that playlist out afterwards. I don't want to go too in depth into yarn fibers because I find that that is a whole other video in itself, but my general recommendations for cool weather knits would be, my current fave is the Senna's Garn Peer Gint, which is 100% Norwegian wool. Another option is the Filcolana Peruvian, which is 100% Peruvian Highland wool. If you want a more budget option, that could be Drops Nepal, which I believe is a wool and alpaca mix. For warm weather yarns, I love the Knitting for Olive Cotton Merino. You can also use their pure silk. And for a budget-friendly option, you know how I feel about Drops Nepal. I love the Drops Nepal. That is a cotton linen viscose blend, so it is really perfect for warm weather climates. Yarn weights refer to the thickness of the yarn. This is a table that I got from Ravelry with the breakdown of different yarn weights. The table gives a big variety of sizes, but the more common yarn weights range from a lace weight all the way to a bulky size. So lastly, the yarn formats. There are 4 different kinds of formats that yarn can come in, and the first one that I usually knit the most in is a yarn ball. So as its name suggests, it comes in a circular ball. It comes in a classic round shape, and it can be used to knit right away. It also comes in a skein, and a skein is an elongated oval shaped bundle, and it also can be used to knit right away. So the third format is a hank. So this is some Sorella yarn, and this is how it looks like. It's so beautiful. Some yarns still come in hanks, especially if they are hand dyed. So this is some hand dyed yarn from Sorella. The reason why hand-dyed yarn usually comes in the form of hanks is because this is the form in which you dye them up, and then you just twist them up, and this is how it looks like. So a hank is basically a large loop of yarn that is twisted together, and this cannot be used to knit with immediately. If you knit straight from a hank your yarn is going to get all twisted up, and that is a nightmare. So to use this, you have to wind it up. And once you wind it up, it will become something like this. And this is called a cake. So it is just this flat cylindrical shape. It kind of looks like a cake. It is so cute. And with this cake, you can pull it either from the center with this yarn. Can you see it here? You can pull it, or you can just knit from the outside. So here, so there are two options. You can do from the center or from the outside. I personally do like to knit from the outside because I find that knitting from the center sometimes causes a bit of knots as well, and I'm not such a huge fan of that. I find that it's very disruptive to my knitting, but maybe I'll try it with this one. To wind these yarns up, you can either hand roll them, which is what I would suggest doing if you are new to knitting, or you can use a yarn swift and a yarn winder, which will definitely make your life much easier. But it is a bit more pricey. Until this day, 1 year in, I have yet to buy a yarn swift because I just haven't gotten around to doing it. I just loop the yarn around my chair instead, around the back of my chair. Let me just show you guys. So I will just take this out over here, and then I'll just open it, and then I'll just loop it around my chair instead. And I think that works just as well. Of course, it is not the most aesthetic of things, but it works. So this video is also me trying to de-influence you from getting certain things, especially if you're new to knitting. I do not want you guys to have to spend so much money just to get started knitting, only to find out that you don't actually like it. So yeah, knitting doesn't have to be very expensive. Now that you have all of this knowledge, it is time to transfer this existing knowledge into interpreting a yarn label. So I have got this yarn label from Knitting for Olive, and I would put like maybe a photo of it up here. But basically this yarn label is going to be really helpful when buying yarn. There are quite a few things that this yarn label will tell you. For example, yardage, weight, gauge, which then tells you what yarn weight this yarn is, and then the recommended needle size, and also washing care instructions. So for the particular one that I'm holding up, it says that it is 250 meters and 50 grams. Just gonna put this up here for a short while. So it kind of shows you the yardage, so 250 meters per 50 grams. It tells you the recommended needle size, which is 3 millimeters. It also tells you to wash in a temperature of 30 degrees Celsius. On the other side, it tells you what color it is. So this one is Dusty Banana. It is 70% organic cotton, 30% extra fine merino. This number over here that you see, 99703. This is the dye lot. Dye lots are important to look out for when buying yarn because you want to make sure that all the yarn that you're going to buy, for example, all this yarn that you're going to buy for a particular top or a garment is all from the same dye lot. This may not be very apparent, but actually the colors from different dye lots do differ. And if you buy your yarn from different dye lots, there's a chance that your final garment will end up being knitted up in varying shades. And it'll be quite obvious once it's knitted up, even though it may not be obvious in the ball or the skein. So definitely if you are going to buy all your yarn for a same project, just make sure that they are all from the same dye lot. If you run out of yarn, for example, try as much as possible to find the same dye lot when restocking your yarn. So that's just a hot tip. The next thing that will set your first project up for success is a gauge swatch. I find that gauge swatch can be quite contentious, but let's start with the definition of a gauge swatch. So a gauge swatch is a small sample knit with specific yarn and needles. Check if the needles and yarn give the correct gauge for the project. A gauge swatch is important because you don't want a situation where you end up with a sweater that is way too big or with a top that is way too small that you can't fit into it. And that can happen if your gauge is too different from that of the pattern designer's gauge. So a gauge swatch, in my opinion, is also good to test out the yarn and needle combination to see if the specific yarn and needle will give you the resultant drape and the opacity that you want. So for example, after knitting this gauge swatch up, I decided that I like the combination because of the drape that ensues. I also just want to make sure that it's not see-through. For example, if you're knitting really thin yarn with too big needles, that can result in it being see-through, and then they will tell you that you need to size down a needle size. For example, in measuring gauge, a lot of patterns go by the number of stitches and rows per 10 by 10 centimeters or 4 by 4 inches. So this doesn't mean that you just knit a 4 by 4 inch square and call it a day, but rather you are supposed to knit a gauge swatch that is bigger than that. Because the sides of the gauge swatch will be inaccurate, you can see that they roll up, and if you were to hold it flat, then you're just kind of pulling it out of its original shape or size. And also there's just a lot of curling that's going on. It's just not accurate. So you want to measure right in the middle of the gauge swatch. So with that being said, I am quite lazy, so I do not knit a huge square. Like even this is actually not really considered big enough, but I generally knit around 6 by 6 inches or 15 by 15 centimeters of a gauge swatch, and then I just measure it in between. I just put the ruler here and I just make sure that the 4 inches is right in the middle of the square with a little bit of allowance on either side. If that's okay, then I will just start knitting until the length is sufficient such that I can put the ruler here, and then it'll be a 10 centimeters or 4 inches gauge swatch with a little bit of allowance on the top and the bottom. So that's how I do my gauge swatch. So the sequence of doing a gauge swatch is you just knit a square, and then you just wet block it, which means to just put it in some water. Just use room temperature water, let it soak for around 15 minutes or so. If you want longer, that's also fine. After that, you take it out, you just wring it, lay it flat on the table, let it dry like that. And then after you're done, you can measure, and that's your gauge. So for me, I like to measure the gauge at 3 different occasions. So the first point is when I'm just done with doing the gauge swatch before blocking. I measure it 1 time, and then I block it, lay it flat. After it's completely dry, I measure it 1 more time. And the idea behind doing the pre and the post blocking measurement is to be able to see if my yarn is going to grow after blocking, if it's going to stretch out, and if it stretches out by how much. And then I will from there kind of calculate the percentage in which it will stretch out. Of course, with that being said, this is a tiny gauge swatch. It's not going to compare as much to an actual full-size garment. It will not be as accurate as compared to a full-size garment, but for me, I find that that gives me a little bit of an indication, and from there on I can kind of do a little bit of guess and check in doing my knitting for my final garment. And the last point in which I measure is after I'm done laying it flat and measuring it, I will actually hang it up on the side of just hang it up like that vertically, and I'll just pin something heavy at the base of my gauge swatch, and then I'll leave it on for maybe a couple of days, like 24 hours at least. And after I'm done with that, take it up, put it on my table once again, let it rest for a bit, and then measure it. So the idea behind that is because I want to mimic the weight of a full-size garment on this tiny swatch to see if the weight will cause it to stretch, and once again, if so, by how much. And this is actually a suggestion in Patty Lyon in her book, which I actually read and I totally recommend. And coming up with different recommendations for YouTube channels and different books that I would recommend you guys, I'll do that in the last episode of this series, so in the post-knitting episode, because I find that this episode will be way too long if I have to talk about that as well, so I'm pushing that to the last. But basically that's what you can do. So with knitters, I find that they sometimes can get a little bit obsessed with getting gauge. I find that that is a very elusive thing for me. I don't generally get gauge for any of my patterns, only one pattern so far. So that is with a lot of knitters, they end up changing the yarn, changing the needles, changing from metal to wooden needles and vice versa, trying to knit more loosely or more tightly to get gauge. And I find that that is just really difficult. Like, what are we doing this for? At the end of the day, you may not actually still get gauge after doing all of those things. So to what end are we doing this for? So for me, and for me specifically, before anyone comes at me, I want my gauge swatch to work for me and not the other way around. So basically, when I do a gauge swatch, I am actually more concerned with the resulting fabric. When I knit a gauge swatch, I want to see, once again, is the drape okay? Am I going to like the final feel of the garment? Is it going to be too hot? Is it going to be just the right amount of stiffness that will get the final look that I want? Is it going to be opaque, or is it going to be a bit transparent? Those are actually the kind of questions that I ask myself, and that actually causes me to change the yarn or the needle, if any at all. And I do not actually change the yarn or needle if I don't hit gauge. Reason being, if I already have a certain yarn in mind in knitting a fabric, I'm not going to change up my yarn just because I don't hit gauge. I find that that makes it very restrictive, and I just don't really want to do that. So there are 2 ways to do math to get your final garments in the correct size, even if you do not get gauge. So let's say I'm knitting a size small. The first way is to change the stitches and rows in the small size pattern to suit your gauge. This is a bit more tedious because you have to change all the stitches and rows throughout the entire pattern. The second option, which is easier, is to find out which size you should actually be knitting based on your gauge swatch. If it sounds confusing, don't worry, I'll explain in a moment. Generally speaking, I prefer the first option, and the first option is something that I've tended towards in trying to get the final garment to fit me, even though my gauge swatch may be off. So I prefer it especially for simple stockinette garments, something like my camisole number 9 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. So you can see that this is a simple, no design, all the way top down, just simple stockinette, which is basically just knit stitches throughout. And this is something that is really easy to change the number of stitches and the rows because there's no pattern involved, there's no lace, color work, or cable design going on. If it is a bit more complicated, like there is some form of design element to it, then I would recommend the second option. But I find that the final fit, if you were to do option 2, may not be as good as option 1. That's just a personal take. Reason is because when you go up from a size small to a medium to a large, the different segments of the garment don't change proportionally when you go up from a small to a medium to a large. That's because the body proportions of a size small differ from that of a size large. So if you're making a size large because of your smaller gauge, but your body proportions are actually that of a size small, then it might be a bit different. For example, the depth of the yoke, like the armhole area, the positive or negative ease, will all be a bit different. So that's just something to take note of. It may not matter too much if you're just going up one size or going down one size, but if you're going up multiple sizes, that may be something that will be more apparent if you were to do option 2. So let's go through both options and I can just kind of explain the math to you guys. And for this, I will be using the step-by-step sweater by Florence Miller because it is a free pattern. So I decided to just use her pattern as an example. So let's just do option 1 first. So for example, her gauge is 16 stitches by 20 rows. Let's just do the stitches, but the rows are the same math. For the stitches, she has 16 stitches. Let's say I am at a smaller gauge, which means I have within a 10 centimeter measurement, I have 20 stitches inside, because each stitch is smaller, so therefore you can have more stitches fitting inside a 4-inch or a 10 centimeter gauge. So therefore I am at 20 stitches. So I would do my gauge over the pattern gauge, that is 20 over 16. Then you would do an equation, so equal to the final stitch that you need to cast on over the pattern stitch. So let's say she requires you to cast on 10 stitches for a size small. So that will give you 20 divided by 16 equals to 1.25. Multiply that by 10, so you have to cast on 12.5 stitches. Sometimes it gives you a little decimal point, in which case you can just round up or round down depending on if you prefer more positive ease or less positive ease. So you can do 13 stitches if you want a more looser fitting garment, and then you can round down to 12 stitches if you need a more tighter fitting garment. This is something that I kind of figured out on my own, and I just did like trial and error to see what fit better. So that is option 1 for you. The second option is to find out what final size you need to knit, and that is something that's a little bit more popular as an option. I think a lot of people use this as a method. But the second option, for example, I am normally a size small, so let's say I am the size B. So for her case, in 10 centimeters, she has 16 stitches. I need to see how long 16 stitches for me will be for my gauge. So because my stitches are smaller than a pattern's gauge, let's say that 16 stitches for her reaches 10 centimeters. For me, it only reaches 9 centimeters. So that would give me 9 divided by 10, which is 0.9. So from there on, I will go back to the different measurements. Let me just try to pull up the different sizes that she has over here. Okay, so the measurements go from, let's say I'm normally a size B, and that is 100 centimeters. So I need to multiply by all the different sizes to see it will give me a finished bust circumference of 100 centimeters. So 0.9 times 110, let's go up one size, will give me 99 centimeters. So that will be the closest to 100. So therefore, instead of knitting the size B, I will go up to a size C. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. If you guys are not sure about anything, or if you guys need more clarification, just comment down below. I will try my best to answer. But this is just basically how you do math to make the pattern fit you. And I find that once you are able to do the math to make your gauge swatch work for you and to find the better fitting garment for you based on your gauge swatch, I find that that lends to a lot more flexibility in choosing yarn. You no longer have to choose yarn that is, indicated by the designer and to die trying to knit a gauge swatch that fits exactly to the designer's gauge. I think that this just gives a lot more flexibility. You can use the yarn that you actually want to use and not have to use, just so that you'll be able to meet gauge. So now that you know all these tools like getting gauge, your knitting needles, what cables, what yarn to use, now it is time to start choosing your first project. So here's a disclaimer that knitting isn't only for cold weather projects. I am a knitter that lives in a tropical climate. I've mentioned it a lot of times, and I have knit so many summer garments. So I just want you guys to also know that you're not limited to just knitting sweaters. If you find that knitting a huge entire sweater is something that is really daunting to you guys, maybe you want to start off with something more simple like a camisole or a tank top, something without sleeves. That would be really fast, and I think that would just make you not want to quit knitting as easily as if you were to make your first project sweater. And I know that some people do recommend to start with a simple dishcloth or a scarf. I did start with a scarf, and you can do that, but if you do that, it might get too tedious that it might bore you out of knitting altogether. So here are some good beginner patterns that I want to suggest for you guys if you want to make a nice garment and you don't want something that is too daunting or too difficult. The first one is, of course, the step-by-step sweater by Florence Miller. This is a free pattern, so you don't even have to pay for the pattern. She is super clear and concise in her instructions, and she also has a whole YouTube video talking about how to make this sweater. You can also make the sabai top. It is a pattern by Paula Strict. It is so easy. You just need 4mm needles. You don't even have to change any needle sizes. You just do some simple increases. You don't have to do any finishing. So it's super easy and a totally beginner friendly pattern. You can also knit the Ivy top. This is a pattern by Petite Knit, and that is a top that I just finished knitting as well. It was so fun, and I think it was really easy to follow. And so if you are looking for beginner summer patterns, those two are good options as well. I do believe there's also a free shorts pattern available on YouTube, so if I do find it, I will link it down in the playlist as well. A website that I want to turn you guys towards, if you guys have not heard of it yet, is Ravelry. So Ravelry is a good resource for patterns. I just want to show you guys how to kind of understand Ravelry in terms of like the description of the patterns and the projects to know what pattern will be suited for you. So let's use the step-by-step sweater by Florence Miller as an example. On the page, you can see a few photos and images of the pattern on the left-hand side, and in the middle portion it tells you who published it, what category it is, when it was published, the suggested yarn, which in this case is Drops Nepal, the yarn weight, which is Aran weight yarn, the gauge, which is 16 stitches by 20 rows, the needle sizes that need to be used, which is 4.5mm and 5.5mm, yardage, sizes, as well as languages that it comes in. So the main thing that I look at when I look at all these information, the things that I just focus on is actually just the gauge. So I just look at the gauge, and from there on I can kind of get an idea of what yarn I need. So this goes hand in hand with the yarn weight as well. 16 stitches is an Aran weight yarn. From there on I would just decide what yarn I should knit with. Also for the yardage, so it tells you 675 meters to 1575 meters. For me, I would just use this, and then of course, because you have your yarn label as well, if you kind of have an idea of what yarn you want to use, you just divide, let's say 675 meters. For example, I am using, let's say I'm using the Sanders Gun Peer Gyns. So I have the yarn label over here. From there on, to decide how many yarn balls that I need to buy, the Sanders Gun Peer Gyns, it comes in a 50-gram skein, and it is 91 meters per skein. I will just once again do some math. There's actually quite a lot of math associated with knitting. So what you do is just take 675 divided by 91, and that would give you 7.4 skeins of yarn, in which case I would just round up to 8 skeins. So that's how you decide how many skeins of yarn you need to get. Always err on buying more yarn rather than less, because you do need some extra yarn to knit your gauge swatch. And if you have too little yarn, so like I said, sometimes if you need to buy extra yarn, it may be from a different dye lot, in which case the sweater might have different colors. So yeah, I usually just end up buying more rather than less. And then once you scroll down a little bit, there is a short description for the sweater. It tells you the construction of the sweater, in which case this sweater is a simple raglan sweater with no complicated techniques, perfect as your first garment knitting project. It has a relaxed fit and 2 options for the neckline. So that just tells you the different techniques that you kind of need to know. Moving downward a little bit more, it tells you the measurements as well, and that will help to guide you in choosing what size you want. So the measurements are 90 centimeters for the smallest size, size A, and 150 centimeters for the size G. So for her case, it tells you your finished garment bust measurement, and from there on you can decide like which size you want to make depending on how loose or baggy you want your sweater to be. If you want a more baggy sweater, then you choose a size up. If you want a less baggy sweater, a more tighter fitting sweater, then you choose a size down. But for some patterns, they actually kind of incorporate the amount of positive ease into the pattern itself. So positive ease is just how big the garment is in relation to your bust circumference. So for example, let's say your bust is 80 centimeters and the final garment is 90 centimeters, then that means there is 10 centimeters, then that means there is 10 centimeters of positive ease. Or on the flip side, if your bust is 80 centimeters and the final garment is 70 centimeters, that means that there is 10 centimeters of negative ease. So that is how you kind of know or get an idea of how much positive or negative ease there will be into a sweater. Sometimes the designer will incorporate the ease into the final measurements in telling you like the final sweater measurement. Some designers, on the other hand, will tell you that you will expect, let's say, 10 centimeters of positive ease in the garment. And then in choosing the sizes, they just tell you the bust circumference. So sometimes you just have to read through the instructions a little bit more to know what the final sizing actually refers to, if it refers to the garment's measurement or your bust circumference measurement. So yeah, that is how you interpret a pattern, and that is how you choose your first pattern. And with that, we come to the end of the first episode of this Knitting 101 series. I hope that this was helpful and educational for you guys, and if you have any questions, of course, don't hesitate to comment down below. Let's make the comment section a really nice, educational and helpful comment section. So if you are also, like me, have been knitting for a couple of months now, you are maybe an advanced beginner or an intermediate sort of knitter, then feel free to help all those beginner knitters down below with your own tips on what you feel a beginner knitter should know when starting to knit. With that, that's all I have for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one in episode 2, Peri Knitting. Bye!